Okay, so I think we'll get started. So firstly, a very, very warm welcome to this session on publishing ethics. Thank you very much for joining. And I'm very, very pleased here to welcome these speakers for today. First, we have Professor Margaret Rees. Margaret is Editor-in-Chief of Case Reports in Women's Health, Executive Editor of European Menopause and Andropause Society. Margaret is also a leading voice in research and publishing ethics. And amongst her many other roles, she was a member of the COPE committee. Many of you will be familiar with this group, and actually had a spell as a secretary of COPE. She also chaired a National Health Service Research Ethics Committee for 7 years, and is on the Northumbria University Research Ethics Committee for 2 years. So as you can see, she's very, very well placed to talk to us today about publishing ethics. And I'm also very pleased to welcome my colleague, Katrina Fennell. Katrina is Director of Journal Services at Elsevier, and I think it's fair to say is a bit of an expert in all things publishing ethics. So thank you, Katrina, for joining us today. And finally, my name's Steve Wims. I'm Society Business Director, and I work in the journals group of Elsevier. Now, before we move on, some housekeeping. First, to say this session will be recorded, and what we plan to do is we will send it out as a Society's update article in due course, so do keep an eye out for that. And although your phones will be muted today, there's a number of people on the call. Please do send through questions using the chat function. What we will do is we present, Margaret will present, Katrina will present, and then we'll loop back to me at the end of the presentation and we'll pick up those questions. And I would say if you would like to enable the transcription function, then please do so just by clicking on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So before I hand over to Margaret, I would like to do a poll. So I'm hoping to bring this up now, and this will help to inform what we cover for the rest of this presentation. So let me launch the poll now. So if you go ahead. So the question is, which of the following topics are you most interested in hearing about today? Is it plagiarism, conflict of interest, funding, author contribution, ethics approval and patient consent, or paper mills? So I'll give you another 30 seconds to answer those, and then we will end the poll. Great, 5 more seconds, and then we'll close the poll. Great, so we can see here 27% plagiarism, conflict of interest 18%, paper mills down the bottom 27%. So that seems to be the main category. And then funding, author contribution, ethics approval, all 9%. So yeah, looks like Katrina, Margaret, paper mills is probably the #1 priorities with plagiarism, followed by conflict of interest. So useful to have that. So thanks very much, everyone. And we will actually have a poll at the end of the session as well, which I think would be useful. So anyway, with that, I'm going to close the poll down. And very pleased to hand over to you, Margaret. So Margaret, over to you.
Anyway, thank you, Steve. Can I have my first slide, please?
Yeah, let me just try and make this out of the way. There you go.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about publication ethics and learned society journals, having edited a society journal in the form of Maturitas for Elsevier, but previously another society journal for the Journal of the British Menopause Society. And I'm now editing the Case Reports in Women's Health, which is a non-society journal. Next slide, please. So journal editors and publishers, whether they're society journals or not, want to publish honest, reproducible data without data fabrication, falsification, duplication, salami slice, or plagiarism. And studies need to comply to international guidelines. Next slide, please. So coming to what I did, I was appointed as editor-in-chief of the British Menopause Society Journal in 1998, and it was called the Journal of the British Menopause Society. It was not on PubMed at the time, and the journal was owned by the society and still is, and the staff were limited because the society only published one journal. So there was me for scientific content, a news editor and typesetter, and a printer. It also meant that I had to do a lot of administrative work, such as sorting out proofs and distribution to reference libraries. The journal got listed on PubMed in 2002 at its first attempt, and this then led to attraction by publishers. So the Society accepted the offer by Royal Society of Medicine Press. And here my life was transformed because I had a journal manager and I was able to access publishers when I had problems I didn't know how to resolve. They were also able to develop the journal, and the journal was name change was from the Journal of the British Menopause Society to Menopause International in 2007. I then left at the end of 2008, and currently the journal has the same model. So it's owned by the society, but the publisher is Sage, and the journal is now called Post-Reproductive Health. Maturitas is owned by Elsevier. It is the official journal of the European Menopause and Andropause Society, EMAS, and it is affiliated with the Australasian Menopause Society. When I was working on the British Menopause Society journal, the policy was that I had to provide an editor's report at each society board meeting, but was not allowed to join the society board as a member. There were no such constraints with Maturitas. So I became a board member, I then became the president, and I'm now the executive director. I note that the British Menopause Society policy has changed since, in that one of the editors-in-chief has become the society chair for a couple of years. Can I have the next slide, please? So throughout this time of editing society journals, the important thing was to have a separation of two hats. And this was quite easy because the COPE guidelines published in 2008 gave very sound advice. I was on COPE Council at the time these guidelines were published. So it states at the outset that journals of learned societies are an important part of the scientific literature, and their management should be of the highest quality and ethically sound. The next sentence, the relationship between the journals and the societies is often complex. And the main issue is editorial independence. And to achieve this, membership of the board of the directors of journals should include non-society members. Next slide, please. Then there's the issue of conflict of interest and its management. And examples were given were financial, publishing. The society might have on its board the editor of a competitor journal, or somebody who is employed by a competitor publisher. And then there are non-financial conflicts of interest. and then the need for confidentiality. Next slide, please. So in 2019, COPE republished these guidelines, and in essence, they are the same. So editorial independence, inclusion of non-society members on the board of directors of the journal. Next slide. Conflicts of interest and confidentiality. But then what was added, which I find very useful, next slide please, were the key points: clear boundaries and expectations regarding editorial decisions should be within an agreement between a society and a journal editor. Transparency to ensure that the journal maintains transparent and ethical processes. Transparency in selecting third-party support for the journal, such as printers or advertisers. The journal website should also clearly state its ethical practices for authors and reviewers. Management of the journal and ownership of the journal should be clear on the journal website. And there must be a review of policies from time to time, and they suggested when a new journal editor is appointed. Next slide, please. So what would a journal editor of a society journal look for in a publisher? To me, the most important thing are editorial submission systems which are maintained so that editors can check manuscripts before peer review. So the tools are authenticate, similar articles on databases, PubMed titles, author searches, and so on. And this gives some insight about plagiarism, attempts at duplicate publication, and salami slice publication, to mention but a few. There needs to be a good and well-maintained guide for authors, which is updated as guidelines change. There needs to be editor training and support. Going from the British Menopause Society Journal to Maturitas was fantastic for me, in that Elsevier provides training and support for its editors, and have do's and don'ts for authors to ensure that the submissions are up to speed. Next slide, please. One thing which is a major issue, and this was shown in the poll, is dealing with paper mills. So you have manufactured manuscripts submitted to a journal for a fee on behalf of the researchers, with the purpose of providing easy publication for them, or to offer authorship for sale. How do you pick this up? There's faked or manipulated data or images. There's use of stock images. Plagiarism checkers used to be helpful, but this may not be detected because there might be translated versions of an article, or the use of paraphrasing, or computer text generators. And something you might pick up are tortured phrases, so counterfeit consciousness replaces artificial intelligence. Another thing that comes out is a paper has been accepted, and then suddenly the authors want to add in extra people. And this could be that the paper has now been put for sale. There's a nice story in the Retraction Watch about a researcher using their medical degree because their dissertation had been based on paper mill papers. Next slide, please. Another thing that's of importance are predatory journals. So if a society is looking for its official journal or publisher to avoid are predatory journals. These are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, lack of transparency, and the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices. I'm sure you all get emails in your junk box asking you to submit to such journals. And these are commercial companies that publish without peer review. Next slide, please. So how can you pick out a predatory journal? They're not on a recognized database such as PubMed or Medline. The website has spelling and grammatical errors. The street address is questionable for a publisher. There are few or no published articles available. The editorial board is not listed, maybe the wrong expertise or they're dead. One example that was shown to me was a physics predatory journal who listed Sir Richard Dole on the editorial board. At that time, he had been dead for over 10 years, and his expertise was on lung cancer and smoking. Next slide. Then there is something new, hijacked or cloned journals. These mimic legitimate publishers by creating a clone website or registering an expired one. And they accept papers without peer review, collect fees from the authors, and they're often wildly out of scope of the original publication. Next slide, please. So what about transparency? At the end of each publication, you will see a series of disclosures, and Katrina will be talking more about this. So there's contributor, who did what? Funding, was it funded? Was it not? Who funded it? Is it a research council? Is it a pharmaceutical company? Then, if applicable, ethical approval and patient consent if the study applies to work in human beings. Data sharing if applicable, and if the participants consented to this. So studies which started decades ago, before data sharing was thought of, would not have consented to this. And there are also privacy issues. Then there's clinical trial registration and provenance and peer review. Now, this is important. Is the article commissioned or not? Was it peer reviewed or not? And for editorials, they're often commissioned and not peer reviewed, but that's not absolute. And if an author is related to the editorial board, either a member or family member, therefore it must be absolutely clear who coordinated the peer review. and Katrina will be talking about that. And then there's conflict of interest, which could be financial or non-financial. Next slide, please. Then we come to whistleblowers, where editors need the help of the publishers, because an editor will get few contacts from whistleblowers, but a publisher will have significant expertise. So what happens? A published article is criticized via direct email to the editor or the publisher. The concerns could be anonymous or not anonymous. The tone may be aggressive. Criticism might refer to something that was published years ago, decades ago, before electronic publication systems came into being, and the authors might be dead. So there is a very good COPE flowchart. The first thing is to assess the validity of the claim, and this should be the editors in line with the publishers. And then there's the process of investigations. Contact the authors and ask the institution to investigate. Obtain the guide for authors at the time, because there might have been different stipulations, and look for any records regarding the submission and peer review, i.e. obtain information from as many sources as possible before coming to a decision. Trying to get archive records of the submission as peer review is difficult if societies change from one publisher to another. Therefore, it is essential that in changing publisher, records must be kept and be accessible to the next person. Next slide, please. So, learned society journals have an important role, and a learned society journal may be considered to be linked with one country, but the publications have global reach despite being nominally linked to one country or continent. And maintaining ethical standards of society journals is essential for the international reputation of the society. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Margaret. As always, whenever I listen to Margaret speak, I always learn a lot, and no different today, so thank you so much. My name is Katrina Fennell. I work in Elsevier in a role that works across all journals, all different subject areas. So I work on ethics, but it could be in any subject area. So I sort of see issues from all sorts of angles, and different types of issues tend to come up depending on the field. So my role involves three areas, basically. Myself and my team help to advise publishers and editors on handling ethics allegations, especially retractions. And the second part of my role is working on projects and new initiatives to try and catch ethical issues pre-publication to prevent them actually hitting the literature. And I'll talk about a few of those initiatives today. And then the last area I work on is on policy and overall policies that sort of make sense across maybe not all our journals, but most of our journals. So that could be things like patient consent. Usually we tend to think at Elsevier we already have a policy on most things, but actually regularly we have a new topic that comes up where we need to come up with a general policy, and that always involves listening very closely to editors and what they consider to be best practice. The first slide. Thanks, Steve. So what I'm going to talk about today a bit is the role of what is the role of journals and publishers, and particularly how can publishers support editors and societies in this shared task of protecting the literature, basically. And I'll do a quick summary. I'm sure a lot of you have deep knowledge of this already, but just to give a quick overview of the different types of issues that we see. And then I'll talk about Elsevier's general approach to publishing ethics, how we approach the topic. And then I'll give a little bit of time, which is related topic of data sharing. It's a little bit maybe on the edge of ethics, but I find there tends to be a lot of interest in that topic. So I'll spend a few minutes on that. Next slide, please. Ethics is something that for anyone who works in journals, anyone who works in good journals, respectable journals, this is really so core to what journals do that I think we almost take it for granted that this is fundamental to what a journal does. And it's very often what differentiates journals from, for example, preprints, which, you know, nowadays there's a lot of talk about the increase of preprints, but journals do something different. And at least we like to think we do something different and special that brings value to the research community. And a huge amount of that is around safeguarding quality and integrity with all sorts of checks that go on during peer review, during the editorial process. As Margaret was talking about, you know, checking for all these very meticulous things like conflict of interest statements, checking for ethical approvals and so on, but also looking out for ethical issues, but also really looking at the quality of the paper, because the quality and the integrity tend to be tied very closely together. So what Elsevier considers our role here to be is really providing the best resources and processes and tools that we can provide to the editors and the societies. Because Elsevier, we are not the subject matter experts, of course, and ethics is usually very tightly linked to the topic of the paper, the medical content or the scientific content of the paper. So we're providing advice and tools, but the decision-making, of course, always stays with the editors and society. And one example of that is around correcting the literature. So for example, with retractions, I look at all the Elsevier retractions before they happen. So I've seen by now probably about 2,000 retractions in detail. And I can provide advice to editors and societies about that, around the process of making sure they follow, that the code process has been followed. But the decision, of course, is always with the editor. But we do have quite a lot of experience, and that can be helpful because very often editors are retracting a paper for the very first time and the whole process is very new. So the fact that we have done it thousands of times collectively can be very useful for the editor to benefit from some of that experience. Next slide, please. This is some research Elsevier has conducted into trust and the extent to which researchers believe they can trust research content and research output. And you'll see there's, you know, most researchers feel there are some research outputs they cannot trust. And the reasons they mention are things that we're talking about today, of course. Exaggerated findings, manipulated images. For example, we see that very often with paper mills, that the images have been copied or manipulated. Data not being available, which I'll talk about. Conflicts of interest not being declared properly, which Margaret has talked about, and I'll talk a bit more about how Elsevier can help with that. But also very often just researchers saying, well, how I try to find trust in research is to see, was it published in a peer-reviewed journal? And that really helpful, that validation process is really helpful for researchers. Next slide, please. And you won't be surprised to see this, but the media attention that circulates around ethical issues can be really quite large scale. And this was even, you know, I had this slide, very similar slide before COVID even happened, right? That already there was a lot of media attention on ethical issues in research. But of course, COVID has really brought this home to the public in a way that perhaps it hadn't fully before, the importance of being able to trust in the literature. And you see, even just in the last couple of days, there was a new article about, I think it was 25% of medical researchers in Australia not declaring all their conflicts of interest. And you see this whole question of trust. It works on so many different levels because, I mean, there's the basic question of, can I trust this article? It's sort of the simplest level almost. But it ties into then perception of, well, can I trust papers from a certain country? Or can I trust, you know, can I trust papers in psychology? After there was a big scandal in psychology, it can create doubt. And then you see at the highest level, where you see these articles like science is broken, goes wrong, it can really impact the public's trust in science at all, which, as we saw with COVID, with the lack of confidence in wearing masks or getting vaccinated, that has very serious consequences. So this is a serious business that we're all engaged with, and I know our editors are extremely passionate about this topic, which I really appreciate to see that every day. Next slide, please. So I won't, we could talk about this slide on its own just for an hour, so I won't do that, I promise. But just to talk about some of the main categories that the US Office of Research Integrity has this kind of classic definition of misconduct, which by now is perhaps possibly a little bit dated, but so the classic definition of misconduct is falsification of data, fabrication of data, and plagiarism. And if you see the topics that you reflected as being you're most concerned about, they fit almost perfectly actually with that definition in terms of paper mills, fake data, fake authorship, plagiarism. I personally have added peer review manipulation in here because personally I also find that very serious. And that is something that sometimes paper mills are also engaged in, which is faking the peer review process. I would personally consider that almost as serious as the FFP, the falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. Now, some people define integrity as sort of more or less the absence of misconduct, so the absence of falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. Other people talk about integrity and ethics in a much broader way and say, well, actually, maybe we need to be more worried, not about the few percent of people who do really dodgy things, but we should be more worried about the many people who do a few small, more gray area issues, but that more people do them. And for example, authorship issues, gift authorship, ghost authorship, people cherry picking data, key hacking, those kind of practices that probably many people do on a smaller scale. Some people think that may have a bigger impact on science collectively than the sort of, let's call them the few bad apples that people tend to talk about with the very serious cases. Next slide, please. One thing I would say that has changed my view a little bit on this concept, I always sort of thought about this as like, there's a few very dodgy, a few questionable people, and most people are honest. I still do believe that, but I do think the concern with groups like paper mills is what I call industrialized cheating. That when you have a company who have a very strong commercial incentive to basically scale cheating, I think that is a much bigger threat than what we saw in the past, which was 1 or 2% of authors who tried to cheat. I mean, some of them would be successful, of course, but when you have somebody with the financial incentive to cheat, then it's a whole different story. It's much more serious, I think. So Margaret talked about the importance of prevention and education. And I think this is super important. There tends to be, I think, an idea that people should just know ethics. You should just be sort of, by the time you're an adult, you should just know it. Your parents should have taught you right from wrong, and it's as simple as that. I don't think it is actually that simple. I mean, personally, I every day have very nuanced conversations about ethics of what's allowed and what's not allowed. I don't think it's all black and white. So I think it is very helpful for journals to have clear policies of what they expect from authors. And we see that, for example, that example with the insufficient declaration of competing interests. That's a very common area of confusion. And I think genuine confusion that people are not sure what they're supposed to declare. So that's something we've been working on. One of the topics that is probably one of the more obscure, one of the hardest topics to get a clear answer on is the guidelines around editors publishing in their own journals or editors handling papers where the editor might have a connection with the authors. And you might expect that there would be a clear set of rules out there that say, okay, editors just should not publish in their own journals. That's not the case. Neither COPE nor WAME or ICMG or Elsevier, nobody really says that editors shouldn't publish in their own journals, because of course there may be circumstances where that is appropriate. And particularly, for example, if you're launching a new journal, it's pretty common for editors and board members to publish in the journal. It's also a way of showing confidence in the journal. So we all sort of know that editors shouldn't publish too many papers, but nobody can really tell you what the number should be. And we have looked into that before, of like, should there be a percentage guideline of, not more than X% of papers in the journal should be by the editors. And we have discussed it many times also with many editorial boards. And in the end, we decided that you cannot really come up with concrete numbers. It's too specific to the journal, to how niche the journal is and how new the journal is. So what we did come up with, which matches with WAME guidelines and COPE guidelines, is that editors, if they are publishing in their own journal, they should not be touching that paper. They shouldn't have any say in it. They shouldn't be choosing the reviewers. They shouldn't be making the decision. All of that has to be delegated to somebody else. And that's the most important point, that the editors shouldn't be involved. And that ideally there should also be a statement somewhere in the article, either as Margaret mentioned in the peer review governance or in the conflict of interest statement, to make it clear that one of the authors is an editor on the journal, but they had no involvement in handling the paper. And we have, sorry, next slide, please, Steve. We have integrated this into a tool that Elsevier has built recently. And this tool was built to some extent because of some difficulties, practical difficulties journals were having using the ICMJE form. So the tool is compliant with, follows the same sort of categories as ICMJE, the same principles. But what it does is at the end, it generates a statement for the author in a basic Word file, but that makes it very easy and practical for that to be put into the article in the production process. And this also includes a reminder, if there's an editor or board member, a reminder to them to declare that as a potential competing interest. So if you're interested in using that, especially if you're using ICMJE, and I know they changed their form about a year and a half ago, I think it was now. The new form isn't as sophisticated. You might be interested in moving over, trying this tool out. Next slide, please. Again, around prevention, one of the topics Margaret was talking about was contributorships and authorships and who did what on an article. And this is becoming more and more, I mean, it's always been important, particularly if you're in medicine or if you follow the ICMJE rules around authorship, you probably have always paid attention to this, but in other fields, it's probably given a bit less attention. And this is credit is a community standard. Elsevier was one of the groups that was involved in developing it, but there were many others, including funders, and there was started with a workshop in Harvard. And it basically is very simple. It has 14 different contributions, and authors are just asked to say which type of contribution each author made. Now, this can be very useful for preventing authorship disputes because it sort of forces authors to have this conversation before the paper is published, instead of having these terrible arguments we have sometimes after publication. But it's also useful for what Margaret talked about, some of those practices of paper mills, where paper mills are selling authorships. And for example, you get the new submission with the list of 4 authors, and then when it comes back at revision, suddenly there's 8 authors. Well, the credit statement is a very useful mechanism to say, okay, explain to me where did these 4 authors, what's the contribution these 4 authors suddenly made at revision stage that justifies them being added to the paper. It gives them a good mechanism for getting more transparency from authors. Next slide, please. Margaret talked, I mean, there's a lot of interest in plagiarism, and the main tool that most journals use, both in Editorial Manager, also in Scholar One and other editorial systems. The sort of common tool is Similarity Check, which has been around now for a good 10 or 13 years or so. As you probably know, if you're using it, it's not a magic bullet, in the sense the editor still has to put quite a bit of time into interpreting the report. And for example, the one example I'm giving here, this is a preprint where if somebody has a paper on a preprint server, the tool will give a really high percentage because it finds itself, basically it matches itself. So we do have to be careful with that. The other issue Margaret raised, which is a very good one, is there, again, with probably paper mills, people coming up with ways to game the software. So what Margaret talked about, those tortured phrases, where they come from is basically they're trying to, they put the text they've copied, they put it through, say, translate it to French and then translate it back into English again. And that mangles phrases. So for example, one of the funnier ones I saw recently was, instead of the United States of America, it became the conjoined counties of America. And that tricks Authenticate. Now, Authenticate are busy working on this at the moment, trying to ensure they can detect this stuff. Elsevier is also, we have a lot of our own data scientists. We also have a group of data scientists who are working on the same problem. So how do we detect this? because unfortunately, these types of agencies are basically learning how to game all these software. So we have to be continuously improving them. Next slide, please. And then related to this so that's Similarity Check, as you may know, is very much around text. It doesn't even look at the images at all. We have another problem, which is detecting duplication or manipulation of images. And now, obviously, this is a problem in its own. If people are faking their images, it's a serious problem. But also, it's very important for detecting paper mills. Because what we find is that the paper mills, I suspect, to be honest with you, the paper mills run their papers through Authenticate before they even submit them. They know full well how Authenticate works. They're not going to get caught with text plagiarism because they know how to avoid that. And it's not super hard for them to avoid that. They just write an original paper in the sense they haven't copied it, but fake in the sense that the research never happened. But they have to get the images from somewhere. So being able to detect this image stuff is a very important challenge that I've been now actively for the last 5 years looking at different companies and different potential solutions to this. Next slide, please. So I'll just share with you some of the companies we have been looking at, and some of you may be already have helped us with piloting some of these tools. If you have given us feedback, thank you very much, because without the editor feedback, it's useless. Basically, we really need to know how useful the editors find the tools. You'll see in the last, actually, many of these tools have emerged in the last couple of years. I even forgot there's a new one from China called Fig Check, which has just emerged this year. And this is very encouraging. So this is really now we're seeing enough competition. Also, the tools are getting better. They're competing with each other. And we're starting to see tools that are actually useful. And some of them are coming from academia. Some of them are coming from commercial companies. Elsevier is looking at everything. We don't care where the solution comes from as long as we find a solution. So in case you're interested in being involved or trying out any of these tools, do just let us know or contact your publisher. I have to say, one of the things we find quite common with these tools, if you're in the area of life sciences, you'll be familiar with a lot of issues with images or with Western blots. A lot of these tools really struggle with Western blots. And that's the most common reason we sort of stopped looking into a tool, to be honest, is that it cannot handle Western blots. And then that makes it, well, not super useful. So that seems to be the biggest technical challenge. Next slide, please. You may already be aware of this. Margaret mentioned that there's also a duplicate check within Editorial Manager, and that is checking for duplicates within the same journal. So that's been there for a while. You're probably already familiar with it, but I wanted to mention is that we're often asked about detecting duplicates between journals. We are working on that. We have a pilot running that we just started about 3 weeks ago, actually. One of our data scientists built an algorithm to detect duplicates between journals. And that seems to be going very well so far. We're doing it in a sort of a basic way right now, which is basically the editor gets the 2 editors, or actually sometimes 5 editors. We've also had 5 papers submitted to the same paper submitted to 5 journals at the same time. And we basically send them an email with the abstract, the title, and the authors of the apparent duplicates. And we ask them then to, if they need to look into more detail to compare, are they really duplicates? But it seems to be going quite well so far for the first couple of weeks. And we're really hoping to expand that over the course of the year. This has been something we've been a challenge we've been looking at for years. So we're happy to finally be able to offer something to journals. Next slide, please. Just to mention, we talked about resources and helping editors and societies with dealing with issues. We obviously would love to prevent everything, but the reality is we cannot prevent every ethical issue, and some of them we only find out about after publication. And for that, we have a resource kit, which our editors or publishers also use it to kind of walk step by step through how to handle a case. And this uses some resources from COPE. So the flowchart you see on the right is from COPE, but also, for example, form letters that we've written along with our legal department, which means they're sort of safe to use in terms of emailing authors and so on. Next slide, please. And so this is some of the resources. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Committee on Publication Ethics that Margaret served as secretary for many, many years. Some of you may have also been actively involved. They do have great resources. All our journals are entitled to membership. I would say that I think in a very positive sense, make 95% of their content available to everybody, whether you're a member or not. So you don't really need your login or your membership to access their content. One of the few things they have, which is only for members, is their e-learning modules, which are quite good. But otherwise, most of it is just there. You don't actually need to log in to get access to their information. Next slide, please. I'm just going to mention also, because there tends to be a lot of focus on retractions, and of course retractions are extremely important, but I just wanted to mention there are other mechanisms for correcting the record, and there sometimes can be lower awareness of those. And some of those are things like power agenda, expression of concern, which we're starting to use more and more, especially when investigations take a long time. For articles in press, Elsevier usually uses withdrawal for those. We do have, if you ever have a very serious issue, and by that I mean, for example, a drug dosage issue that would really kill someone, or a patient privacy issue where we've accidentally published some information about a patient, really personal information, we can remove articles, which means remove the images and the text altogether. We don't like to do that, so we keep it for the very serious cases. And we can replace also, if it's appropriate, for example, if it's just one photograph and it's not essential, we can black out the photograph or something like that. Just so you're aware that there's some other mechanisms other than retraction. Next slide, please. This is just to emphasize sort of the way we handle retractions is the goal is for them to be fair, transparent, accurate, and accessible. So if a paper was a subscription article, when it's retracted, it's made freely available. And that is to avoid that somebody basically is asked to pay money to access a retracted article. And we put this big red retracted watermark across it, which, as you can imagine, some of the authors are not very keen on, but the idea is to make it very clear to reader there's no ambiguity about the paper being retracted. Next slide, please. I wanted to just quickly mention, talk a bit about data sharing, because I think it's a topic that's getting more and more interest. Several years ago, Elsevier came up with a set of policies around data sharing, and there's 5 policies, policies A to E. You can see them there on the bottom in the image. The simplest one is encouraging data sharing. The next one is also including data linking. Then we talk about mandating a data statement and so on, and it moves up the way until we get to policy E, or basically data journals, where the actual data is peer reviewed before publication. And the reason we did this was we could see that journals had very different needs and were at very different places in terms of how they wanted to approach data sharing. And that's appropriate. I mean, for example, a case reports journal, we wouldn't want to encourage data sharing because we could actually then just be encouraging privacy issues. Whereas, for example, the ICMJE a couple of years ago has made the recommendation that all clinical trials should have a research data statement. For us, that would fit with our policy, what we would call policy C. And most of our journals have now chosen a policy that suits their journal at the moment. If you haven't done that, feel free to contact us or as your publisher. We can easily arrange that to find a policy that works for you, and that we put that in the guide for authors, and we also integrate it into the workflow in Editorial Manager if you're using Editorial Manager. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to show something kind of optimistic for when we started doing this several years ago. And we simply started facilitating data sharing within the editorial system. So at the moment the author was submitting their paper, we just asked them, would you like to also, after your paper is accepted, have your underlying data posted on a data repository? And we did not make it mandatory. This was all optional. But what we saw was that the amount of data sharing basically doubled. That without having to force anybody or mandate anything, actually just making it easy for people already helped. So we're optimistic. We know there is some reluctance from authors. We understand that. We also know there are some very good reasons to be reluctant in terms of patient privacy. So we're at the moment working on our guidelines for authors to make sure that if we are asking people to share data or encouraging it, that we're also giving them very good guidelines on de-identifying data and certain data that just should not be shared at all. So that's just a flavor. Sorry, I was touching on a lot of topics very quickly there. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to give you a sense so at least you know then topics that you could potentially maybe be interested in getting more information on. And I think we have some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Katrina, and also to Margaret. Fantastic. So we've got 10 minutes or so left, and there's some questions come in. So first from Kurt Barnhart, thanks for your question. If a journal is associated with a medical society, who makes the decision a paper is fraudulent, the editor-in-chief or the society? Katrina, would you like to comment on that, or you can pass over to Margaret? What do you think?
Do you want to start, Margaret, from your personal experience?
It's the editor-in-chief in consultation with the editorial board. The society does not get involved in that type of decision.
I think some societies, though, do have an ethics committee, which then is a little bit of slightly different structure, right?
I mean, some journals may actually have an ethics advisor, and I had an ethics advisor for Maturitas, and I have an ethics advisor for case reports in women's health. And they work on research ethics committees dealing in human health.
Is that one individual then Margaret?
I have one individual who is on the Open University Human Research Ethics Committee.
Yeah.
The numbers will depend on your needs, so you have to be flexible, but at least have one that you can refer to.
Yeah, I've also seen committees where the society has a standing committee, ethics committee that looks at the cases, but then I would still expect the editor-in-chief to be closely involved to be making the final decision. So it's a question of the difference between advice or recommendations and actually the decision, which I would still expect the decision to be with the editor normally.
Okay, thanks both. I think that's very useful. Another question from Malcolm. Our guide for authors contains nothing on the ethics of specimen, fossil, mineral, etc. collection and trading, and I have had to get these inserted. Tracking the source of materials described in papers can be difficult, especially when slave labor might be used in their collection. Editors are quite exposed in seeking out such malpractice or in trying to obtain confessions for illegal actions.
Yeah, we've had some very, very tricky cases in this area, I must say. So you know that Elsevier has some general policies, general guide for authors, and we do tend to be guilty, I must confess, that we will tend to focus on having general policies on topics that hundreds of our journals or many of our journals require, and archaeology is not probably Elsevier's strongest area. We don't have hundreds of journals. So what does sometimes happen in these cases is that then a journal like yourself comes along and creates a very good policy. And we then ask if we can basically reuse that and apply it to more journals. So this can happen that the journals that first experience the issue, they see the need for the policy before Elsevier realizes there's a need for the policy. And then we're basically asking, well, is it okay if we reuse that text for more journals? Because we definitely are seeing issues here also with the whole question of native groups and respect for native groups. We've also seen some journals where it's being suggested that there shouldn't be anything published that relates to, a native tribe without approval from a committee related to the tribe, for example. We've also seen difficult issues in terms of the whole history, obviously, of specimens being removed from the original source, and whether or not people actually had permission to bring them back to their museum, which might have been 50 years ago, might have been 20 years ago. And some of these rules have changed, of course, over time. So yeah, that's definitely a very tricky area.
Great, thanks, Katrina. One further one here from Danny Lambert. Thanks to the presenters. I'm curious about the rationale for encouraging society publishers to have non-society members on the board of directors of their journals. Yeah,
when you edit a journal, you need to have a skill mix of an editorial board, which is commensurate to deal with assistance for peer review of your submissions. And you therefore appoint editorial board members with the necessary skills, and they may be on the editorial board for a couple of years. Society board members change often every year, every 2 years, or every 3 years, depending on each society. So you have to consider them as independent entities.
Great, thanks, Margaret.
Steve, I see there's a few questions about image checking.
Yeah, do you want to take those? Yeah,
they're related, so I'll
please do.
put them together because so Professor Davies is asking about Western blots and cell images, and indeed those are the two, basically the top of our list if we're assessing a new image checking tool. Western blots and cell micrographs are the top of the list basically. If the tool can't handle Western blots, we don't take it further because that's so important. So by now we have found some tools that are useful. If you contact us, we can give you an account. You can try it out and test it and give us feedback if you find it useful. And indeed there's two. I know two of the tools are working with Aries to have the tool integrated into EM in a sort of a similar way that Authenticate is integrated. So you click on a link in EM, then you more or less kind of leave EM and go into the environment of the tool where the images have been checked and the results are there. So that is big work done. From the journals that have been trying out these tools for us, we have been discussing like where in the process is a good place to check. And most people seem to be checking a bit further down the workflow. So either when the paper is about to be revised before they ask for revision, or when the paper is close to being accepted. Some of that is also practical reasons in terms of the time it takes, but also you may have seen there was a very good article in Nature about image checking tools just before Christmas. I think a lot of people missed it because of the 23rd of December or something, but one of the companies that was being interviewed used the opportunity to make it extremely clear that nobody should expect image checking tools to be as cheap as text checking tools. And that is certainly our experience so far, that the cost of these tools is much, much, much higher than text checking tools. So that may influence where in the process the papers are checked in the end, because as you probably know with EM, we push all the submissions through at the very beginning. So it's 2.5, 2.6 million submissions a year are checked or go through Authenticate. If you have a tool that's many, many times more expensive, it may make more sense to check further along the process. So that's something we're still working out, where the best place. I mean, if the cost would be acceptable, then the earlier the better, of course, would be my view.
Great, thanks, Katrina. Any other questions from anyone? Please post them now. I think we're coming to the end of this session. What I do want to do before we close is to have another poll. So I'm going to launch the poll now. So the first question, has this webinar helped your understanding of publishing ethics? And it's either yes, no, or a little. And then the second question, what publishing ethics topics would you like to hear more about in the future? So we've got plagiarism, conflict of interest, funding, author contribution, ethics approval, patient consent, or paper mills, or possibly other. And if you have other, if you can just place that in the chat, that'd be useful just for we have a record of that. So I'm going to give you another 30 seconds or so. Okay, so has it helped your understanding? Yes, 77%, a little for 23, 0 no. So that's pretty good, thank you. And then on what future topics would you like to see? It's fairly evenly split. So conflict of interest, 40%, seems to be particularly of interest. Ethics approval at 37%, plagiarism at 33%, funding, and then paper mills less so. Now, of course, paper mills came up earlier, so hopefully we've addressed a lot of what you wanted to hear about, which is good. There's other at 10%. So great. Yeah, you should be able to share that. Yeah, hopefully you can see that on screen. Yeah, so I think it's some ethics approval and plagiarism. But that's really useful, and conflicts of interest is really useful to have that, and that will help to inform future webinars. So we are looking at possibly having a follow-up to this webinar at some point. So really good to get that feedback. Before we close the session, Margaret, anything to add from you or Katrina?
No.
No.
Thank you
Okay.
all for taking the time.
Yeah, great. Well,
Yeah, so thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate that. And a big thanks to both Katrina and particularly to Margaret for taking the time. I know you have a very busy schedule. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of today. Thank you.